In the cradle of civilization, where two great rivers carved fertile valleys into an otherwise arid land, human history took its first monumental leap. Between the waters of the Tigris and Euphrates, the Sumerians had already built a patchwork of city-states, each ruled by kings who believed themselves favored by the gods. These cities, Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Kish, Nippur, stood like islands of brick and stone in a sea of desert, each competing with the other for dominance, each carrying the seeds of civilization, yet struggling to unite under a single vision. It was here, in Mesopotamia, that an empire unlike any before would rise, reaching for the heavens in its ambition and crumbling into dust within just a few generations. This was the Akkadian Empire, remembered as the first empire in the history of the world. The story begins not with the cities themselves, but with the life of one man, Sargon of Akkad. His origins are shrouded in both legend and historical fragments, for the ancient scribes told of a man who began as a cupbearer, a servant in the court of Kish, yet rose to forge an empire that stretched farther than any city-state ruler had ever dreamed. According to one tale, he was a child abandoned at birth, set adrift in a basket on the river, discovered and raised by a gardener. Whether fact or myth, the story reflects a deeper truth. Sargon was a man who came from outside the entrenched order, rising not through lineage, but through will, ambition, and unshakable vision. By the mid-24th century BCE, the balance of power in Mesopotamia was fragile. Cities had grown strong and wealthy, their temples towering, and their trade networks stretching outward to the mountains and the sea. Yet this prosperity came at the cost of endless rivalries. Wars between Uruk and Kish, Lagash and Umma, left the land scarred and the people weary. In this chaos, Sargon seized his opportunity. Serving initially as an administrator and military commander under the king of Kish, he proved himself capable, cunning and ambitious. And when the time came, he took power, overthrowing his master and declaring himself ruler of Kish. But Sargon's ambitions were never confined to one city. With disciplined armies and a revolutionary approach to leadership, he marched south into Sumer, defeating city after city, toppling kings who had once considered themselves chosen of the gods. Uruk fell, Ur surrendered, and Lagash bowed to his might. His campaigns did not merely seek conquest, but consolidation. Unlike the shifting victories of rival kings, Sargon envisioned something greater, a realm that bound all of Mesopotamia under one crown. The heart of this new dominion was Akkad, a city whose exact location has been lost to time, swallowed by the centuries and buried beneath the soil of Iraq. From Akkad, Sargon proclaimed himself not merely a king of cities, but king of the world, the first ruler in history to claim dominion over all lands he could reach. In doing so, he laid the foundations of empire, an entity larger than any city, bound by administration, trade, language, and culture, as much as by force of arms. What made this achievement possible was not only military might, but innovation in governance. Sargon established appointed governors to oversee conquered regions, loyal to him rather than to their old local rulers. He placed his trusted men, and at times his own daughters, in powerful positions, intertwining family and authority with divine legitimacy. His daughter Enheduanna, high priestess of the moon god Nanna in Ur, is remembered as the world's first known author, composing hymns that not only praised the gods, but reinforced the supremacy of her father's rule. Religion, poetry, administration and war, all threads woven into a tapestry of empire. The Akkadian Empire also expanded outward beyond Sumer, stretching into Elam to the east, into the Levant to the west, and northward toward Anatolia. This expansion was not only territorial but cultural. Akkadian, a Semitic language, began to replace Sumerian in administration and daily life, though Sumerian would remain the sacred tongue of scribes and priests. For centuries afterward, Akkadian would endure as the language of diplomacy and record across the Near East, a testament to the empire's far-reaching influence. The image of Sargon as a world conqueror is reinforced in inscriptions and legends that have survived millennia. He boasted of standing at the shores of the Mediterranean, of subduing distant kings, of building cities and temples that bound heaven and earth. His reign was portrayed as divinely ordained, his victories the will of the gods themselves. Yet behind this grandeur was a careful balance of pragmatism and vision. He did not destroy the Sumerian heritage he inherited, but built upon it, creating a synthesis of cultures that would outlast his own dynasty. Still, the seeds of instability were present even in these triumphant years. The logistics of empire strained resources, and ruling vast lands required continuous campaigns to suppress rebellion. Cities that had once enjoyed independence bristled under Akkadian governors, and local rulers chafed at the loss of autonomy. The very scale that made the Akkadian Empire revolutionary also made it fragile, demanding constant assertion of power to hold the peripheries together. Nevertheless, the reign of Sargon marked a new chapter in human history. Never before had so many lands and peoples been drawn into a single political entity. Never before had the idea of empire itself been realized with such clarity. Sargon's rule redefined kingship, setting a precedent that countless rulers after him, from Babylon to Persia, from Rome to beyond, would attempt to emulate. Yet for all its glory, this empire was not immortal. Its rise carried within it the promise of decline, its unity always threatened by the very forces it sought to control. But in these first decades, when Sargon marched victorious across Mesopotamia and declared himself king of the world, the Akkadian Empire stood as the boldest experiment in power humanity had yet undertaken. It was the dawn of empire, a dawn that would shine brilliantly before fading into twilight. The victories of Sargon reshaped Mesopotamia into something entirely new, and yet an empire is never the work of a single man. What he built in war had to be sustained in peace, and that required order, administration, and vision. From the city of Akkad, whose walls and streets have vanished into the dust but whose name still echoes in history, he and his successors began the slow work of turning conquest into governance. The empire stretched like a vast web across the land, binding together people of different languages, traditions, and loyalties, and it was held in place not only by the sword, but by the pen, the temple, and the storehouse. The Sumerians had long been masters of writing, of clay tablets inscribed with the wedges of cuneiform, and this skill became the lifeblood of empire. Orders could be dispatched, taxes recorded, treaties preserved, and hymns composed to the glory of Akkad's kings. Sargon recognized the power of writing to solidify his rule, and through his reign, Akkadian language began to rise, written alongside Sumerian but increasingly dominant in administration and law. For the first time, a Semitic tongue replaced the ancient speech of the Sumerian city-states, creating a linguistic bridge between peoples who had once seemed so different. This was more than communication. It was the planting of identity, the shaping of a new cultural order that outlived the empire itself. But no empire is free of unrest. Even at the height of Sargon's power, revolts broke out in distant provinces. Conquered cities longed for their independence, and ambitious local leaders saw opportunities when the king's armies marched elsewhere. To counter this, Sargon left behind a network of loyal governors, military garrisons, and religious appointments that tied authority to his family. His daughter Enheduanna was perhaps the most striking example. As high priestess of Ur, she embodied the union of Akkadian power and Sumerian religious tradition. Her hymns to the goddess Inanna not only expressed devotion, but also declared divine legitimacy for Akkad's rulers. Through her voice, the gods themselves seemed to sanction the new order. Still, the empire required constant vigilance. Sargon is said to have fought more than 30 battles in his lifetime, and toward the end of his reign, widespread revolts nearly tore the empire apart. The old city-states of Sumer had not forgotten their pride, nor had the rulers of Elam, Subartu, or Mari accepted subjugation easily. Legends tell us that Sargon grew weary in his final years, facing rebellion after rebellion, his enemies encircling him on all sides. Yet his authority held, and when he died around 2279 BCE, he left behind a realm unprecedented in scale. Power passed to his sons, Rimush and Manishtushu, and through them to his grandson, Naram-Sin, who would take the Akkadian Empire to even greater heights. But succession was no simple matter. Rimush inherited his father's throne amid chaos. Rebellions flared as cities sensed weakness in the transfer of power. Rimush was ruthless in response. Texts describe the slaughter of thousands in Ur, Umma, and Lagash as he stamped out dissent with iron will. Brutality was the price of survival, and for a time it worked. Yet Rimush's reign was cut short, his life ended by palace intrigue, perhaps murdered by his own officials. His brother Manishtushu fared little better. He turned his energies outward, campaigning against Elam and expanding the empire's influence eastward, even reaching toward the Persian Gulf, where trade routes brought wealth from distant lands. Yet he too fell victim to assassination. The empire's heart was strong, but within the palace, ambition and rivalry threatened to undo what armies had secured. The throne of Akkad seemed cursed, contested not only by foreign foes but by betrayal within. It was Naram-Sin, Sargon's grandson, who emerged as the empire's most formidable ruler after Sargon himself. His reign would come to symbolize both the glory and the arrogance of Akkadian power. With keen military skill, he expanded the empire to its furthest limits, pushing into the Zagros Mountains, defeating the powerful Lullaby tribes, and securing trade routes that linked Mesopotamia to Anatolia and beyond. In his time, Akkad reached its zenith, stretching from the Mediterranean shores to the Persian highlands, its influence radiating across the known world. Naram-Sin's victories were immortalized in art. On a great stone stele carved with care, he is depicted climbing a mountain, his enemies crushed beneath his feet, his soldiers following in awe. What makes this image striking is not merely the triumph, but the symbolism. Naram-Sin wears the horned crown, a symbol of divinity. He was the first Mesopotamian king to claim the title of God of Akkad, elevating himself beyond mortal kingship. For his subjects, this was both a declaration of majesty and a bold challenge to tradition, for never before had a ruler so openly proclaimed himself divine. This act reflected both confidence and peril. By portraying himself as a living god, Naram-Sin sought to unify the empire around his person, to create loyalty not only through fear or duty, but through worship. Yet it also set him apart from the ancient order, where kings were servants of the gods, not equals to them. Some saw hubris in his claim, a dangerous arrogance that might provoke the wrath of the divine. Later generations would remember his reign not only for its grandeur, but for the disasters that followed, interpreting them as punishment for his pride. For now, however, Naram-Sin's empire was secure. Akkad became the beacon of the ancient world, its culture spreading far beyond its borders. Trade flourished, with goods from distant lands flowing into its markets. Copper from Oman, timber from Lebanon, silver from Anatolia. Merchants carried Akkadian language and customs across frontiers, while soldiers enforced order in provinces far from the capital. The Akkadian system of governance, centralized, bureaucratic, and tied to the king's authority, was refined to its peak. And yet beneath the splendor lay fragility. To maintain such a vast realm required constant campaigns, endless resources, and unbroken loyalty. The land itself began to feel the strain. Droughts struck Mesopotamia during these years, reducing harvests and testing the empire's capacity to feed its people. In times of plenty, unity could be sustained. In times of scarcity, rebellions smoldered. Naram-Sin confronted these challenges with force, but history remembers a moment that marked the beginning of decline, the invasion of the Gutians, mountain tribes from the Zagros. At first, these raiders seemed little more than a nuisance, but over time they became a constant thorn in the empire's side. Naram-Sin defeated them in battle, but their incursions drained resources and destabilized frontier regions. They were a reminder that empire could expand outward only so far before the peripheries resisted endlessly. Yet the memory of Naram-Sin's reign remained dazzling. He embodied the height of Akkadian ambition, a ruler who dared to claim the mantle of godhood, who carved his image in stone as conqueror and divine king. His successes masked the growing cracks in the empire, the same cracks that would widen after his death and plunge Akkad into chaos. For now, though, under Naram-Sin, the Akkadian Empire seemed eternal, its reach unchallenged, its vision limitless. The world's first empire had never shone brighter. In the shadow of Naram-Sin's victories, the Akkadian Empire appeared unshakable. From the shores of the Mediterranean to the mountains of Elam, from the fertile heartland of Sumer to the rugged highlands of Anatolia, the king of Akkad held sway over lands and peoples never before united. The monuments and inscriptions of his reign speak of triumph, of enemies subdued and cities brought under order. Yet history has a way of reminding us that no power, however absolute, is eternal. Beneath the surface of Akkad's grandeur, forces of change were stirring, some within, some from beyond its borders, and some in the very earth and sky. The heart of Akkadian success was its ability to weave together diverse traditions into a single system. The Sumerian legacy of writing, religion, and urban life became entwined with Akkadian administration and language. Temples dedicated to ancient gods thrived under new patronage. The hymns of Enheduanna continued to echo in sacred precincts, proclaiming divine favor upon the house of Sargon. In the streets of Uruk, and Akkad, merchants carried their goods, scribes pressed their styluses into clay, priests offered incense to the gods, and soldiers marched to distant frontiers. For a time, the empire seemed to balance power and culture in a harmony that promised endurance. But empires are fragile organisms. They require constant sustenance, grain to feed their armies, loyalty to bind their subjects, victories to reaffirm their legitimacy. As Naram-Sin declared himself divine, he raised expectations to near infinite heights. When victories ceased or when disaster struck, the empire's ideological foundation wavered, and disaster did come. Some texts recall that Naram-Sin faced not merely foreign enemies but the wrath of the gods themselves. A famous later myth tells of how he angered Enlil, the chief deity, by attacking the sacred city of Nippur, an act of hubris that brought divine punishment upon his realm. In this tale, the Gutians were unleashed upon Mesopotamia as a scourge, stripping away prosperity and reducing the land to desolation. Whether myth or memory distorted by centuries of retelling, the story reflects a deeper truth. During and after Naram-Sin's reign, calamities struck the empire with unrelenting force. The Gutians were tribes from the Zagros Mountains, hardy and elusive, their way of life alien to the settled farmers and city dwellers of Mesopotamia. They struck suddenly, raiding towns, cutting supply routes, and destabilizing provinces already weary from drought and unrest. Akkadian armies defeated them in battles, but they never vanished. Like the mountains from which they came, they remained, immovable and persistent, chipping away at the empire's edges. Over time, their incursions grew bolder, reaching deeper into the Akkadian heartland, undermining the authority of kings who had once seemed unassailable. Compounding this external pressure was the land itself. Archaeological evidence suggests that a prolonged period of aridity struck Mesopotamia around this time, reducing harvests and placing enormous strain on agriculture. Canals that once fed fertile fields became harder to maintain, and with famine came discontent. Empires can withstand foreign enemies, but hunger within their own borders is a more insidious foe. Rebellions flared anew, not only in distant provinces, but even in the Sumerian cities that had once formed the core of Akkadian power. Naram-Sin confronted these challenges with determination. Inscriptions boast of his victories over rebellious states, of campaigns into Elam, Magan, and the northern lands. He projected strength through art and ritual, continuing to wear the horned crown of divinity and to style himself as the equal of the gods. But behind these triumphs, the empire's resources were stretched thin. Every campaign drained the treasury, every rebellion demanded suppression, every raid from the mountains eroded the aura of invincibility. When Naram-Sin eventually passed from the stage, his successors inherited an empire bruised and vulnerable. His son, Shar-Kali-Shari, tried to maintain the legacy, but his reign was defined by struggle. The Gutians pressed harder, and internal dissent festered. The Sumerian cities, never fully reconciled to Akkadian dominance, seized moments of weakness to reassert themselves. Where Sargon had united the land and Naram-Sin had glorified it, Shar-Kali-Shari fought simply to keep it from crumbling. His reign was marked by constant warfare, famine, and the slow erosion of central authority. The symbolism of divinity that had once exalted Naram-Sin now turned bitter. Where the god-king had promised prosperity, the people saw only hardship. The legitimacy of Akkadian rule waned. Priests and scribes recorded omens of decline, stories of divine wrath, myths that cast the Akkadian kings as transgressors who had broken the covenant between humanity and the gods. The empire's ideology, once a source of strength, became an indictment of failure. And still the Gutians came. They were not conquerors in the style of Akkad, seeking to build monuments or rule cities. They were disruptors, raiders, who thrived on instability. Over time, they settled into the power vacuum they helped create, establishing their own rule in Mesopotamia. To later Sumerians, the Gutians became a symbol of chaos, remembered as uncouth barbarians who did not know the proper worship of the gods and who brought ruin to civilization. Yet in reality, their presence was less the cause of collapse than the symptom of a weakened empire unable to defend its borders. By the end of the 23rd century BCE, the great experiment of Akkad was faltering. The city of Akkad itself, once the gleaming heart of empire, began to fade from prominence. Records of its precise location vanish from history, its bricks scattered, its temples abandoned. The First Empire, which had risen with such ambition under Sargon and reached such heights under Naram-Sin, was entering its twilight. And yet, even in decline, the Akkadian legacy endured. The very idea of empire, the concept that diverse lands and peoples could be drawn into a single political and cultural system, did not die with Akkad. It lived on in the cities that re-emerged after the collapse, in the languages scribes continued to use, in the memories of kings who would later claim to follow in Sargon's footsteps. The fall of Akkad was not the end of history, but a turning point, a reminder that power, however vast, is fleeting, and that human ambition forever balances on the edge of triumph and ruin. The stage was set for the empire's final years, when Gutian dominance and internal strife would bring Akkad to its knees, and the land would await the resurgence of Sumer under new dynasties. But the story of Akkad, the rise and fall of the world's first empire, had already etched itself into the consciousness of Mesopotamia. It was a story future generations would tell not only as history, but as myth, as warning, and as inspiration. The twilight of Akkad descended not in a single catastrophic moment, but in a slow erosion, like the steady wearing away of stone beneath relentless winds. After Naram-Sin's passing, the aura of invincibility that had once shielded the empire dissolved. His son Shar-Kali-Shari inherited the throne, but instead of basking in divine glory, he found himself besieged on all sides. The Gutians pressed from the mountains, tribes that knew no cities and bowed to no kings. The Elamites tested the empire's eastern borders. Within the Sumerian cities, rebellions flared like sparks leaping from dry reeds, each threatening to ignite into a wider blaze. The clay tablets from his reign speak not of triumph, but of endless struggle. Shar-Kali-Shari waged war year after year, yet victories brought no stability. He could crush a rebellion in Uruk one season, only to see Lagash rise the next. He could beat back Gutian raiders in the north, only to find his canals silting and his fields withering in the south. Famine gnawed at the land, the rivers fell fickle, and the people whispered that the gods had abandoned Akkad. For a ruler who inherited the mantle of godhood from his father, such whispers were deadly. What made the Gutians so dangerous was not the size of their armies, but their persistence. They came not to rule vast cities, but to exploit weakness, to raid, to unsettle, to strip away the wealth that had once flowed steadily into Akkad. Unlike the organized armies of Elam or Mari, the Gutians melted back into the mountains after each strike, beyond the reach of Akkadian retribution. They became a spectre, a constant presence that drained confidence and weakened resolve. In time, the balance tipped. Shar-Kali-Shari fought valiantly, but his reign ended in confusion, his successors unable to hold the throne for long. Kings rose and fell in quick succession, their names barely remembered, their reigns measured not in decades but in years. The once mighty Akkadian kingship fractured into rival claimants, each too weak to restore the old order. The empire that had bound Mesopotamia together now splintered apart, each city-state scrambling to survive in a landscape scarred by hunger, conflict, and despair. The Gutians did not merely raid now, they ruled. They descended from the mountains and established themselves as overlords of Mesopotamia. To later Sumerian scribes, their reign was remembered as a dark age. They wrote of Gutian kings who knew nothing of writing or justice, who tore down the temples, who neglected the irrigation canals, who allowed the land to lie fallow. They depicted the Gutians as uncivilized shepherds, enemies of the gods and destroyers of culture. Whether these depictions are exaggerated or not, they capture the sense of collapse, of a world that had fallen from the order and grandeur of Akkad into chaos. In reality, the Gutian presence was less a deliberate destruction than a symptom of disintegration. Without centralized authority, Mesopotamia's intricate system of canals and dikes began to fail. Agriculture faltered not only from drought, but from neglect, and cities once fed by abundant grain grew desperate. Trade networks that had once stretched to Anatolia and the Gulf withered, cutting off the flow of copper, timber, and silver. The carefully balanced machinery of empire unraveled thread by thread, leaving behind only fragments of what had once been the world's first great state. And yet, even in decline, Akkad's influence could not be erased. The Gutians adopted aspects of Mesopotamian kingship, ruling from captured cities and taking titles once reserved for Sargon's descendants. They could not escape the cultural gravity of Akkad, though they lacked its vision and cohesion. The scribes continued to write in Akkadian and Sumerian. The priests still sang the hymns of Enheduanna, and the memory of Sargon and Naram-Sin remained powerful even as their dynasty vanished. The people of Mesopotamia endured. Farmers still tilled what land they could, craftsmen still shaped clay and metal, merchants still carried their wares, though on diminished routes. Civilization did not collapse into ashes. It staggered, weakened, waiting for a chance to rise again. And in that waiting, new powers began to stir. The city of Ur, long humbled under Akkadian rule, would soon reassert itself. The dynasty that rose there, remembered as the third dynasty of Ur, would reclaim much of the land and restore a measure of stability. But this resurgence was still to come. For the moment, Akkad's fall cast a long shadow across Mesopotamia. The collapse of Akkad was not merely a political event, but a cultural reckoning. Future generations looked back on it as a lesson, a story of hubris and divine retribution. The tale of Naram-Sin defying the gods, of Enlil unleashing the Gutians upon the land, became a parable inscribed in tablets and passed down through centuries. To the Sumerians who survived the Gutian age, Akkad was both a cautionary tale and a reminder of possibility. It had shown what human ambition could achieve and how swiftly it could unravel when balance with the divine and the natural world was lost. By the dawn of the 22nd century BCE, the Akkadian Empire was gone. Its kings no longer sat upon the throne of Akkad. Its armies no longer marched across the known world. Its great capital, whose exact stones no archaeologist has yet uncovered, lay abandoned and forgotten beneath shifting sands. The Gutians held sway and Mesopotamia seemed to have slipped backward into disunity, but Akkad's story did not end in silence. Its memory lived on in every city that rose after it, in every ruler who dared to call himself king of the four quarters, in every empire that followed. For though the empire itself had fallen, the idea of empire had been born, and ideas are not so easily erased. And so the fall of Akkad was both an ending and a beginning. The world's first empire had run its course, its rise and fall etched into clay and legend alike. In the generations to come, new rulers would claim to walk in Sargon's footsteps, to restore the order that had been lost, to wield power over lands as vast as Akkad once held. But none could erase the memory of that first bold attempt to unite the world. The age of Akkad was over, but its shadow stretched far across history, a reminder of both the heights of human ambition and the fragility of all that is built by human hands. The fall of Akkad left a scar on Mesopotamia's memory, but scars themselves become stories, and stories become lessons. To the generations that followed, the empire of Sargon and Naram-Sin was never forgotten. Its ruins may have vanished, its walls crumbled into dust, but its imprint upon the imagination of Mesopotamia endured. The Sumerians who rose again after the Gutian domination looked back upon Akkad with equal parts awe and caution, seeing in it both the dazzling heights of human achievement and the peril of overreaching pride. For the scribes of later centuries, the Akkadian kings became figures of legend. Sargon, the orphan who rose from obscurity to rule the known world, was transformed into a hero of myth. Tales were told of his birth and his rise, of how the goddess Ishtar loved him and granted him victory, of how he marched across distant lands and stood triumphant on foreign shores. The image of Sargon outlasted the empire itself, preserved in epics, hymns, and chronicles that carried his name into the memory of later kingdoms. He was no longer merely a king of Akkad, he was the archetype of empire itself, the first to show what one man could do with ambition, courage, and the favor of the gods. Naram-Sin too became immortalized in myth, though his memory was more conflicted. To later Sumerian tradition, he was the king who defied the gods, who sacked the holy city of Nippur, and in his hubris claimed divinity for himself. The disasters that followed, the famines, the raids, the Gutian invasions, were interpreted as divine judgment upon his arrogance. In one famous tale, the gods themselves unleashed ruin upon him for his crimes, casting Akkad into collapse as punishment for his transgression. Whether these stories reflected history or morality, they reveal how deeply the Akkadian experience resonated. The First Empire was not only remembered as a political experiment, but as a cosmic drama, a cautionary tale of the balance between power and humility, between human ambition and divine order. Yet not all was remembered in gloom. The innovations of Akkad endured and flourished long after its fall. The Akkadian language became the lingua franca of the Near East, spreading far beyond the Tigris and Euphrates. For centuries it served as the language of diplomacy, record-keeping and literature, adopted even by peoples who never bowed to Akkadian kings. Cuneiform inscriptions in Akkadian were found from Anatolia to Egypt, proof of how deeply its influence had penetrated the ancient world. While Sumerian remained the sacred tongue of temples and scholars, Akkadian became the voice of empire, the medium through which rulers proclaimed their authority and scribes recorded the affairs of state. The administrative practices pioneered under Sargon also left their mark. The idea of appointing governors loyal to a central crown, of binding distant provinces through bureaucracy rather than mere conquest, became a model repeated by later empires. The Ur-Thrur dynasty, which rose in the centuries after Akkad's fall, revived many of these practices, creating a highly centralized state often called a Renaissance of Sumer. But its structure bore the unmistakable imprint of Akkad. The Akkadian experiment had shown that vast territories could be managed, that diversity could be unified under a single system, and that empire was not only possible, but sustainable, at least for a time. Even the cultural achievements of Akkad reverberated through the ages. Enheduanna, daughter of Sargon, high priestess of Ur, and the world's first known author, became a figure of enduring significance. Her hymns to the goddess Inanna were preserved and copied for centuries, their influence reaching far beyond her own time. In her words, we hear not only devotion, but the assertion of a new kind of voice, one that connected politics, religion, and literature in a way that defined Mesopotamian identity. Through her, Akkad left a legacy not only of power but of culture, one that resonated in the halls of temples long after the empire itself had faded. To the Sumerians who emerged from Gutian domination, Akkad was both inspiration and warning. The third dynasty of Ur, rising around 2100 BCE, sought to restore order to Mesopotamia. Its kings, particularly Ur-Nammu and Shulgi, rebuilt canals, revived trade, and re-established central authority. They presented themselves as restorers of civilization after the chaos of the Gutian age, but they did so by echoing the model first established by Akkad. They adopted the title of King of Sumer and Akkad, consciously linking themselves to the legacy of Sargon's empire, even as they reasserted Sumerian traditions. The very idea of uniting the land under one ruler, of claiming dominion over the 4 quarters of the world, was inherited directly from Akkad. In this way, Akkad became a touchstone for every empire that followed. Babylon, centuries later, would draw upon its memory. Assyria, the great war machine of the first millennium BCE, claimed Sargon as a forebear, even naming one of its kings, Sargon II, to echo the might of the ancient conqueror. The Persians, when they built the vast Achaemenid Empire, carried forward the principle first tested by Akkad, that diverse peoples could be governed through a balance of force, administration, and culture. Even Alexander the Great, millennia later, when he marched into Mesopotamia and gazed upon the ruins of ancient empires, walked in the shadow of Akkad. And yet, the memory of Akkad was not simply one of glory. The story of its fall was equally enduring. To the scribes and priests of later centuries, the lesson was clear. Power must be balanced with humility, kingship with piety. Sargon and Naram-Sin were remembered as mighty, but also as flawed, their pride leading to downfall. The myth of Naram-Sin's punishment became a moral anchor, repeated as a warning to kings who might dare to overreach. Thus, Akkad became not only the first empire, but also the first parable of empire, its rise and fall shaping the political philosophy of Mesopotamia for 1,000 years. When we look back upon Akkad today, through the fragmented tablets and scattered inscriptions that have survived, we see both the brilliance and the fragility of its vision. It was the first attempt to bring unity to the fractured world of Mesopotamia, the first to imagine empire not as a passing conquest, but as a lasting order. It succeeded beyond what its founders could have imagined, and it failed in ways that revealed the vulnerabilities of human ambition. But in that duality lies its enduring power. Akkad was not merely a historical episode. It was the birth of an idea, one that would echo across the empires of the world for millennia to come. The story of Akkad did not end with the Gutians, or even with the Sumerian revival under Ur. It continued to live in the deep currents of Mesopotamian culture, carried forward by scribes, priests, and kings who drew upon its memory for centuries. Though its capital disappeared into the soil and its monuments crumbled, Akkad was never erased. Instead, it became the foundation upon which later civilizations built, a silent presence beneath the surface of Mesopotamia's ever-shifting political landscape. One of the most enduring legacies of Akkad was its language. Akkadian, once the tongue of conquerors, outlasted the empire itself by more than a millennium. It became the standard language of diplomacy, law, and administration across the Near East. Tablets written in Akkadian have been discovered not only in Mesopotamia, but as far away as Anatolia, Canaan, and Egypt. At Amarna, in Egypt, correspondence between pharaohs and foreign kings was inscribed in Akkadian centuries after the empire's fall. What began as the language of Sargon's court evolved into a shared medium for international relations, binding together a world of diverse peoples. Sumerian, by contrast, transitioned from a living language into one of scholarship and religion. Much as Latin would later serve in medieval Europe, Sumerian became the language of temples and schools, while Akkadian was spoken in daily life. This dual linguistic heritage was a direct result of Akkad's ascendancy, the fusion of Sumerian tradition with Akkadian innovation. It was a cultural synthesis that survived long after the empire, shaping the intellectual and religious life of Mesopotamia for centuries. The administrative structures first tested by Sargon also cast a long shadow. The concept of governors ruling provinces on behalf of a central king became a standard practice, refined by later dynasties. The third dynasty of Ur expanded upon this model, creating a bureaucracy of astonishing complexity, with officials recording every bushel of grain and every head of livestock. Assyria and Babylon would, in turn, perfect the system, ruling vast territories through a mixture of local autonomy and centralized oversight. In this sense, Akkad was the prototype, the first to imagine governance beyond the walls of a city, the first to treat administration as the backbone of empire. Religion, too, bore the imprint of Akkad. Enheduanna's hymns remained central to Mesopotamian liturgy long after her death, copied and recopied by generations of scribes. Through her, the worship of Inanna was elevated to a position of supreme importance, intertwining divine power with imperial ambition. The precedent of kings presenting themselves as chosen by the gods, or, in the case of Naram-Sin, as divine themselves, would echo throughout Mesopotamian history. Babylonian kings like Hammurabi would claim to be shepherds appointed by the gods to bring justice, while Assyrian monarchs would frame their conquests as holy wars sanctioned by divine command. The divine aura of kingship, first crystallized in Akkad, became a defining feature of Mesopotamian political ideology. Even Akkad's downfall became a legacy in its own right. The myth of Naram-Sin's punishment, of the gods striking down a hubristic king, was retold for centuries as a moral tale. To later scribes, Akkad was not only the first empire, but also the first warning. Its collapse was interpreted as a lesson in humility, a reminder that kings, however mighty, remained subject to the will of the gods. This moral thread ran deep in Mesopotamian thought, shaping how future rulers understood their power and their limits. Outside Mesopotamia, Akkad's influence radiated outward through trade and conquest. In Anatolia, the Hittites would later adopt cuneiform, their scribes writing in Akkadian alongside their own tongue. In Canaan, local rulers corresponded with Pharaoh in Akkadian, long after Sargon's name had faded from living memory. Even in distant Egypt, Akkadian was the medium of diplomacy, proof of its reach. The idea of a shared international language, of a diplomatic code that bound together disparate kingdoms, was an innovation that began with Akkad and would not be equaled until the rise of later empires. But perhaps the most profound legacy of Akkad was psychological. It introduced the very idea of empire as a form of political order. Before Akkad, Mesopotamia was a mosaic of city-states, each fiercely independent, each struggling for supremacy, but none envisioning unity on a grand scale. Sargon shattered that paradigm. He demonstrated that it was possible to transcend the boundaries of city and region, to bind together dozens of peoples into a single whole. Though his empire lasted only a few generations, the idea endured. Every Mesopotamian king who followed was measured against the standard set by Akkad. Every claim to rule, the four quarters of the world, was an echo of Sargon's dream. In later centuries, rulers consciously invoked Akkad to legitimize their own power. The kings of Ur claimed the title King of Sumer and Akkad, deliberately linking themselves to Sargon's legacy. Babylonian monarchs traced their authority back to Akkad, presenting themselves as heirs to the First Empire. The Assyrians, masters of propaganda, depicted themselves as successors to Sargon, even reviving his name in Sargon II, who reigned in the 8th century BCE. Through these invocations, Akkad remained alive in the political imagination of Mesopotamia, long after its ruins were swallowed by time. Even the physical disappearance of Akkad's capital added to its mystique. Unlike Ur or Uruk, which left behind towering ziggurats and extensive ruins, Akkad vanished almost completely. Archaeologists have yet to identify its exact location, though clues suggest it lies buried somewhere north of Babylon. Its absence has only deepened its legend. To ancient Mesopotamians, Akkad became a city of memory, a place that once existed in splendor, but could no longer be found. Its loss was woven into myth, its disappearance a symbol of the fragility of human achievement. When we trace the arc of Mesopotamian history, we find Akkad at its pivot. It was the bridge between Sumer and Babylon, between city-state and empire. Without Akkad, the trajectory of Near Eastern history would have been unrecognizably different. Its fall was tragic, its duration short, but its influence immeasurable. The Akkadian Empire was the seed from which the great empires of the ancient world would grow. In the centuries that followed, Mesopotamia would rise and fall again and again. The Earth III dynasty would flourish and collapse. Babylon would ascend under Hammurabi, then fall to the Hittites and Kassites. Assyria would dominate with brutal efficiency, carving out an empire that stretched across continents. Yet through each cycle, the memory of Akkad persisted, its echoes carried in language, in kingship, in myth. The world's first empire remained a touchstone, its story retold not as distant history, but as living tradition. And so, Akkad's greatest achievement may not have been its conquests or its monuments, but the idea it left behind. The idea that humanity could dream of empire, could imagine order across vast lands, could envision unity beyond the city walls. That idea, once born, could never be forgotten. Centuries after the fall of Akkad, when new powers rose and fell across the plains of Mesopotamia, the memory of Sargon and his empire lingered like a shadow stretching across the ages. His name was inscribed not only in clay tablets, but in the collective imagination of kings who longed to equal his feats. The empire itself had faded into the sands, its capital lost and its monuments destroyed. Yet in the realm of myth and literature, Akkad lived on. It became more than history. It became a story told again and again, reshaped to suit the needs of each new generation. The Akkadian kings, particularly Sargon and Naram-Sin, became figures larger than life. In texts written centuries after their deaths, they appear as heroes, conquerors, and cautionary figures. Sargon, the orphan child set adrift upon a river, grew in legend into a model of destiny. Later tales claimed that the goddess Ishtar herself loved him, granting him success in war and dominion over nations. His victories became the template by which later rulers measured themselves. His image transformed from a mortal king into a near-mythic founder of empire. Naram-Sin, by contrast, was remembered in darker tones. In later Sumerian stories, he became the archetype of the arrogant ruler, the king who defied the gods. One of the most famous tales tells how, when disaster struck his land, he refused to heed the will of the gods and instead marched upon Nippur, the city sacred to Enlil. By sacking the holy place, he incurred divine wrath. In the myth, the gods responded by sending a horde of Gutians to devastate Mesopotamia, punishing Naram-Sin's pride with the destruction of his empire. This story, though composed long after Akkad's fall, reveals the deep unease that the memory of the empire stirred. Akkad was remembered not only as a time of power, but as a lesson. Even the mightiest kings must bow to divine authority. To later scribes, the fall of Akkad was not merely political or economic, it was cosmic, a collapse ordained by the gods to remind humanity of its place. In this way, the story of Akkad became woven into the moral fabric of Mesopotamian culture, a parable of hubris and humility that echoed through the centuries. Literature preserved these stories, carrying them across time. Tablets found in the ruins of later Mesopotamian cities contain hymns, chronicles, and epics that retell the deeds of Sargon and Naram-Sin. Some present them as victorious rulers blessed by the gods, others as tragic figures undone by their own pride. The multiplicity of these accounts reflects the complexity of Akkad's legacy. It was remembered with admiration and with fear, as both a model to emulate and a warning to heed. The psychological imprint of Akkad upon kingship was profound. Every ruler who claimed dominion over Mesopotamia had to reckon with its memory. When the kings of the Thre rebuilt Sumer after the Gutian age, they did not erase Akkad, they invoked it. By calling themselves kings of Sumer and Akkad, they declared continuity, presenting themselves as restorers of the order first established by Sargon. When Hammurabi later forged his Babylonian empire, he too drew upon Akkadian precedent, adopting the mantle of lawgiver and unifier, echoing Sargon's vision of authority that spanned beyond city walls. Assyria, centuries later, carried the legacy of Akkad to new heights. The Assyrian kings were masters of historical memory, and they saw in Sargon the perfect model of conquest and dominion. When Sargon II ascended the throne in the 8th century BCE, he deliberately adopted the ancient king's name, proclaiming himself heir to the First Empire. His inscriptions celebrated not only his victories, but his connection to Sargon of Akkad, tying his legitimacy to the most ancient and revered of rulers. In doing so, he demonstrated how deeply Akkad's legacy had penetrated the psyche of Mesopotamian kingship. To rule well was to rule like Sargon. Even beyond Mesopotamia, Akkad's legend traveled. In Anatolia, in the Levant, in lands far from the Tigris and Euphrates, echoes of Sargon's name can be found in texts and traditions. To some, he became a conqueror who had reached the ends of the earth. To others, a mythical figure whose feats defied reality. The empire itself may have been forgotten by those distant peoples, but the aura of its founder spread, carried by merchants, migrants, and stories retold in foreign courts. What is striking is that Akkad was remembered not as a simple episode of history, but as a drama that combined politics, morality, and myth. In this, it anticipated the way later civilizations would recall their own founders. How Rome would elevate Romulus, how China would enshrine the Yellow Emperor, how Alexander would become a figure of legend as much as history. Akkad was the first to be remembered in this way, the first empire to enter not only the record of scribes, but the imagination of myth-makers. The survival of these stories tells us something essential about the nature of empire. Akkad was short-lived compared to the millennia of Mesopotamian civilization. Yet its impact was vast because it represented a new idea. That idea, of unity, of ambition, of power that stretched beyond borders, was too powerful to fade with the fall of its walls. It endured in language, in governance, in religion, and in myth. Kings sought to emulate it, scribes sought to interpret it, and priests sought to frame it within divine order. The rise and fall of Akkad became the archetype of empire itself, a story told and retold as long as Mesopotamia endured. And as the centuries rolled forward, even as Babylonia and Assyria fought for supremacy, even as Persians, Greeks, and Romans marched across the Near East, the name of Akkad remained. It appeared in king lists, in chronicles, in epic poetry. Its kings became more than men. They became symbols, their lives transformed into lessons. The story of Akkad was not preserved because it was the first empire, but because it was the first to embody the drama of empire, the rise, the glory, the arrogance, and the fall. To the Mesopotamians themselves, this was the essence of history. It was not merely the recording of events, but the interpretation of meaning, the weaving of human deeds into the fabric of divine will. And in that weaving, Akkad stood at the center, the first thread from which the pattern of empire was spun.